Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Were We Thinking? Design Hindsights from Long-Running Games. A little bit about me. I'm currently the lead game designer at Buy Somewhere. We're working on a location-based property tycoon. And before that, I was at EA Fire Monkeys as the lead designer on Sims Freeplay, and before that, I did a whole bunch of things. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. About Buy Somewhere, FYI, we currently have a position open for systems designer. So if you have a little bit of experience, interest in systems design, and by the end of this presentation you don't think I'm a horrible person, A, I haven't done a very good job if that's the case, but B, feel free to talk to me and apply. So, before we get started, I'd like to know who's working on a game as a service, whether free to play, premium with DLC, anything that's going to live forever, hopefully. Awesome. Well, all of you, I have seen your future. Or maybe more accurately, I have seen the past of the games you maybe aspire to be. I think I'm getting a headache. Let's just say that I'm your self-appointed Time Lord. And I'm here to tell you that future you is thankful for your presence here today. Here's a bit of a view on things that I've done. So I've had the privilege of joining teams that I've worked on games that were 5+ years into their live service cycle. So when I was in Germany, I ended up lead designer on Drakensang, which is a Diablo-like MMO. It's been running for years and it's still going strong. Sims Freeplay here at EA Melbourne, also been running for years. And then by working at these companies, I also had discussion with designers who were working on other products from these companies, like Dark Orbit, Battlestar Galactica Online, Farmerama, Real Racing, which are all also games that have been running for years. And I've also had the pleasure of working with designers who worked at Zynga, King, other big companies who have games that have been running for years. You begin to see a pattern, right? Okay, so working with all of these games, I realized that a lot of these share very similar challenges 5 years in. And then I realized that we don't do postmortems for game 5 years later. We do them 3 months after launch. And that maybe we were missing a gap of information of what happens and how time takes its tolls over the years. And since I'm now working on the prototype and early phases of Buy Somewhere, which is meant to be a game that we hope will last 5 years plus, for my own sake, I wanted to compile what I felt I needed to know. And then I figured, why not share things? Before I get started, you may have noticed when I presented the games that I joined these teams when they were a few years into live service. And today I'm going to be talking about things that we should have done earlier. Please don't see this as me throwing shade at those designers. The only reason why I'm not using games that I've myself designed in the early days is because none of them made them past 5 years, and past Emilie was not good at designing this type of game. So I have made these mistakes. So it's all in the spirit of learning and using examples that you can check out now and get an idea of what I'm talking about. So let's get started. Hindsight number 1. You know nothing. Young Padawan. I want to make it really obvious that no matter how much we think we know about the art of making games, the market is changing so fast that when you're building a game that's going to last for years, there is no way you can predict what will happen. It's not a fault on you. It's the nature of the business. It's changing fast, and every time a new project project comes out, it redefines the industry that we're working in. So when I got started in my career, PC downloadables were a big thing on websites like Play First, Big Fish. Hidden objects had just become their own big game genre. And that brought with it a whole slew of female gamers, which weren't part of our market before. And then Facebook gained momentum. And there were a few very successful Facebook games. So suddenly everyone was doing Facebook games. And then iPhones happened. And then really big successes happened on that. And that redefined the type of games that we want to develop. And it redefined the audience of games, broadening it in ways that we could never expect. Free-to-play became unavoidable, and everyone started talking about it. And within free-to-play, the monetization strategies of how we should make money evolved so much over the past few years that all of the games that I listed at the beginning had to question whether or not they needed to rework the way they approach monetization 5 years after launch. Steam gained a whole bunch of momentum, Greenlight happened, indie games started growing like crazy, now virtual reality is a thing. It just changes so very, very fast that the only thing you can plan for is that you don't know and that you'll make mistakes because you can't predict this. And some of the mistakes will be really small and you're going to have a laugh about them and it's going to be fine. And some of the bigger ones you'll have a chance to fix because these games get updated regularly. So you don't have to drive yourself insane trying to make the perfect game and trying to predict the unpredictable. You'll have a chance to readjust. Which brings us to hindsight number 2. Embrace the minimum viable product. Now, I know that when we come from box development or games that are meant to have a finite end and that you should be delivering in one bundle and never touch again, the idea of a minimum viable product breaks our designer's heart. The idea that we need to cut down on the amount of features and limit what we put in just rubs us the wrong way. You need to start seeing the minimum viable product as an awesome tool in your arsenal when you're working on long-running games. And I wish I had known how powerful that could be. Because you can launch something that's very small and streamlined and very limited in its feature set and learn so much from the users interacting with it. And that's going to help you make it better. But even a stronger point, I'm going to tell you a story about Sims Freeplay. When the babies were first put in Sims Freeplay, it was in the middle of a 6 weeks update. There was only so much that could be done. And the babies were put in as little models that are super cute, but are also stuck in their cribs. They couldn't be picked up. They were just present. And they were a natural segue into the toddlers, which had more things to do when they were released. But we kind of needed to get started somewhere. So you can imagine how, after a few months of having these babies and realizing that all they did was sleep, which, is kind of what a baby does, players started being really eager for more content that had to do with babies. And it took a while before we got around to delivering that content. But when we did, it was one of the most successful updates of the game. Because launching with an MVP allowed us to create desire and want in our community. So by the time we delivered on that content, and you could pick the baby out of the crib, feed them. They even had a hobby when they could tap on a xylophone and make music. It was a huge hit. because there was a want for it, and we met that desire. So launching an MVP not only helps you manage your own sanity during production and prevent you trying to predict the future, it can also be a key strategic tool in the way you want to keep developing your game, making sure that you're developing the features that players want in the way that they want, and that you create a need and a want for these features. Hindsight number 3. When you're about to release a big update or really do anything in your game, you want to make sure that you test everything. Just everything you can. You want to make sure that within your game you have custom telemetry for your different events and design features. Make sure that you enlist the help of people if you don't have those skills in-house. There are contractors for that. And early on when you design the game, think about how you're going to do A/B tests. Is everyone familiar with what A/B tests are? Some people seem unsure. So the idea of an A/B test is that you basically create 2 versions of a thing. It can be a UI element, balancing of an event, or even a game mechanic. And you launch it to some players, and you keep a control group with a different version of it or the feature as it existed already. And then you see which one performs better. A lot of these long-running games didn't think about A/B tests early in their design. They didn't set the game up in a way that they could do them easily. And that means that instead of taking the full power of those users that come in, instead of getting the full impact of that MVP and that opportunity to improve on what you're doing, you're still kind of taking stabs in the dark because you can't really test what you're assuming will be there and what will work. So make sure that you set up for that. And also think about how you can potentially soft launch in that way risky features and changes in your game. For example, in Drakensang, as I said, it's a Diablo-like MMO, and just like the Diablo of old, we had an in-game item that was used to identify loot. So in Diablo that used to be scrolls, we had Crystal of Truth, which was a great way to work the monetization strategy as it existed at the time. Players needed these to identify the loot that they were getting, so a lot of players would start spending on these crystals or would farm for them and get other stuff. But as the years went on and on, players started having inventories that looked like this. They were getting a lot of very exciting loot that they wanted to try, but they couldn't because they didn't have the crystals to identify them. Now, in the reality of a game like Diablo, the core loop is to kill monsters, to get loot, to get better, to kill more monsters. If you get loot that you cannot use, we're breaking the core gameplay. And that's one of the ways that free-to-play monetization has changed a lot over the years. It's not something you want to do anymore. It used to be perceived as a best practice. It's no longer true. Because what we realized, and what a lot of other games have realized, is when you have something that is that severe in terms of monetization, yes, more players will convert, but also a lot of players will leave. So when we ran the numbers, we realized that the only way to move forward was to get rid of the crystals. Now, if there are any producers or product managers in the room, and I'm telling you that in this game we got rid of our biggest conversion item, you probably want to pull your hair out. What we did is we approached it as safely as we could because we thought it would be better. But before doing such a massive change that had a huge impact on our game's ability to generate revenue, we needed to be sure. So the team developed the features and a whole bunch of additional features to make up for the Crystals of Truth not being in the game anymore. and then launched it on one of the smallest servers, on one of the languages that very few of our players spoke. So we did a soft launch in a live game 5 years into its life to test that feature, because if there was a need to roll back because it broke our whole economy, we would only anger a small portion of players. Luckily, it all worked out. The team did improvements and then released it on every server. So if you feel like the things that you didn't know now require you to do a massive change in your game, and you've set it up so you can test everything, there's nothing you can't change with confidence, because you can test it before you launch it. Hindsight number 4. I'm talking about all of this testing, and the only way for this testing to really work out is if you ask the data. During 5 years of running a game, you will amass a wealth of information on your players. You will get to know them very, very well. And you can use that to make your game as pleasant and as entertaining for them as you possibly can. But in order to do that, you need to take into account the information that you want to know as part of your design process. Because when you have that wealth of data, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. And you may have the best person doing your analytics. If they don't know what you want to know, they're not going to volunteer that information out of thin air. So here's one of the things that we started doing on the design teams that I've worked with, is alter our design process a tiny bit to take into account telemetry design. So what we were doing, and what I'm hoping to keep doing on Buy Somewhere, is that as we're designing a feature on the same Confluence page, which is a wiki for those who don't know, which I've used for designing things for years. So on the same page or the same document, we have a section for telemetry questions. And as we design, we list assumptions that we're making. Because the reality of it is that you choosing between option A or option B to design a mechanic is based on what you think is going to work best. When your brain does that, oh, I think this is going to be better, ask yourself, what do I wish I knew before making this decision? Be aware that you're making an assumption. Ask yourself, what information would have been useful to make you decide between those two options? Or in a different way, what would I need to know to make this feature better? If after launch your lead or your boss came up to you and went, you know what, we need to overhaul this, you want to make sure that you've learned from that minimum viable product that you launched, and that you have the information you need to make it as polished as you can the second time around, or the third time around. So based on that list of assumptions and questions I wish I had answers for, we create telemetry event. And then when players start interacting with the features, we get a whole bunch of data, but we know what we're looking for. And from there, we get answers, and maybe our assumptions were totally wrong. That's not a problem. As I said, you'll make mistakes. We kind of have to be comfortable with this. That's fine, but once you have the information, then you can optimize and make it better and better. So make sure you have this little warning bell in your head and develop that reflex when you're making an assumption and designing a thing to list that as a question that you want an answer for. Number 5. This whole data thing, that gives you quantitative data, which is incredibly useful, but you also want to balance it out with qualitative data, which is the feelings and emotions of your players. And in order to achieve that, you want to be best friends with your community manager. And if you can't have one full-time internally, feel free to get in touch with contractors. Again, there are people who do that. Make sure that someone on your team has time to look at the Facebook page and keep it updated. And make whoever is doing that aspect of community management a part of your development team in discussions and what you're considering. For two big reasons. The first one, as I mentioned, is qualitative data. They can tell you what your players are talking about on forums, on Facebook, what they're really happy about, what they're not happy about. And it helps you make your game better if you have that information and strategize around your update and where you're going to put your energy to make your game as good as it can be. And the other thing is that when you make a big mistake, which is likely, because we've all done it, they're your shield. They're the ones managing the players when something goes really, really wrong. And that's a lot of stress for them, and it's a lot of work. So just be aware that your community management team or your community manager is an awesome person. Remember this story about the removal of the crystals of truth? As I mentioned, this was our main conversion items because it could only be bought with premium currency. When we decided to take it out of the game, we had players who had spent a lot of money on getting these and had stocks of them in their inventory. There was a real potential for fire everywhere on all the community. It's a Diablo-like game. It's a lot of min-maxing players. When we did a change to any part of the tuning of the game, they noticed. The community management team on that game took the time to prep a lot of messaging around this. We let people know, they flagged in the design meetings that that could be an issue, which is another important thing. Feel free to include them so they read design documentation and are present in presentation of features and discussion about features, because they have their ears to the ground of what your players are thinking. They can flag when they think something isn't going to go down well. And then they can craft messaging around it. So as part of the plan, we stopped selling crystals of truth ahead of time. We put in place a conversion mechanism so that people who had crystals of truth in their inventory would get premium currency for it. We thought through all of these scenarios and we made sure to message it clearly. The other thing that was in place on this game that you may want to consider is monthly catch-ups with our key community influencers. So for Draken Sang, that was forum administrators in the different languages. We ended up signing NDAs with them so that we could have these discussions of advanced features and let them know ahead of time so that they would be able to help us. They had an opportunity to ask us the questions that they had, and that chat was with the community managers, but also with me, the lead game designer, and the producer. And sometimes when we did rebalancing of different features, what we would do is also make it clear why we were doing it. That we were rebalancing the loot system here so that we could give them the more powerful weapons they wanted. And that all of that was in the interest of giving them the best game possible. And as soon as you establish that line of communication, a lot of the changes that you want to make and a lot of the problems that you want to fix become easier. So, community management, your best friend. Number 4. You will notice that we're now getting into a little bit of the more technical stuff because I'm going to start talking in charts and there's going to be less jokes on the slides. First thing, document your shit. We've all done it. We've all been in crunch time and we've all at some point decided that we couldn't afford the time to document a part of our design. We've all done it. Future you will hate you for it. You may be familiar with the idea of the bus liability factor, or in this case, train. it's kind of a grim metaphor for the idea of, will your project survive the untimely departure of one of your team member? And that can be they leave for another job, or hopefully not get hit by a train. When you have a game that lasts for so long, the likeliness of this happening is extremely high. Your team will change. It's gonna happen. So the principle of the bust liability factor is you want to make sure that when the team changes and someone leaves, they don't take a whole chunk of essential information with them. That puts the rest of the team in trouble. The only way to ensure that doesn't happen is to document your stuff. The other thing is that your memory isn't perfect. Mine isn't either. I forget stuff all the time. Over the course of 5 years, when you're trying to hold a game that is growing and growing and growing and growing in your head, it's impossible. You're gonna forget things. And maybe you can kind of trust that between the other team members, you can remember how things were done. To a certain extent, you can. But then again, if one of those senior team members that were on the project since the beginning leaves, a whole chunk of information leaves with them. And the last reason why you want to document your stuff is to avoid your new recruits making that face. As I've said at the beginning, I've joined a lot of these projects 3-4 years into their live service. And it was long getting on board and getting enough knowledge to be able to make significant impact on the project. And depending on the situation, that expresses itself in different ways. For example, on some projects, I took for granted that the whole team knew how to make a quest, because I knew they'd made like 50 of them. In my head, it wasn't documented, but I could trust the rest of the team to know what went into a quest and call me on it if I forgot something. As luck would have it, the coder for my first quest was also a new recruit. So he didn't catch things that I didn't know because he expected me to know what I was doing. And we had a lot of QA rounds and, bunch of things that were forgotten because no one knew. On every project I've worked on, we've spent a lot of time reverse engineering designs and documenting them and taking our best guess as to how it works. And then, because, as we've established, we know nothing and will make mistakes, when we go back to eventually rework these features, we find out cans of worms that we didn't document because we didn't know that they would be there. And ways that the systems that have grown and grown and grown don't interact well together anymore, and now making a slight change takes a lot of time and breaks a bunch of things. So I can't stress this enough. Documenting your designs is one of the cornerstones of helping your game grow in an efficient way and saving yourself a lot of headaches. There's always going to be a timeline, there's always going to be a budget, there's always going to be an ambitious feature set. If you want to be a hero, document your shit. Number 7, tools. All the tools. Tools are your friends, catch them all. Tools are also one of those things like documentation that when you're short on time, you're like, nah, we'll just hack it together this once and it'll be fine. And for the minimum viable product, that's totally a valid way to go. But as you keep developing your game, you want to develop that reflex of looking at things that take you a lot of time and that you do often. Back to doing quests. On a project I worked on, we designed quests in a Word document because that felt like the natural way to be writing story. And then we send that to code to implement the quest. And then we got a build, we tested the quest, we had comments on it, we sent it back to code, code updated, we got it back, we tested it, sent back to code, la la la. And then once finally the quest was what we wanted it to be, we would go into the XML file of that quest and do the tuning in the XML file. And then that got shipped off to QA. Now what happened here is that QA then had to reference the Word document and the XML file to know if what was showing up in game was the right thing. That's a lot of steps that we did every 6 weeks, 2 to 3 times. So we started looking at, hey, how can we maybe do this better? Took a little bit of time to change the way we design quests and do everything in Excel. Yes. We now have one less step. We would do the quest design in Excel, the text and the balancing data, ship it to code, code implements it, design tests, go around and around until it's perfect, go to QA. QA now only has to reference one document. When? And then looking at this, it's still, you know, a little bit, goes back and forth when you do it 2, 3 times every 6 weeks. It starts to be a lot of time of going back and forth between people. A tool. A tool that basically, on most quests, cut out coders entirely. So going from an XML, a coder wrote a macro, it took a couple of hours, we tested it, it took maybe a few days, and then every quest took about half the time to produce. We still had unique actions every now and then that required a coder, but overall our whole process got really, really streamlined. So as a designer, you're deciding what that content is, and you know what content you rely on and what you're putting in often. Make sure you take a critical look at the way you're working and assessing how you can make it better and faster. And as a team, consider that developing a tool that will make a process faster for something that you will do for 5 years is worth a few days. Number 8, we're almost done, I swear. You want to make sure that you have a big, meaningful end game and a short progression. These are not absolutes. There are other ways to design this, but I do want to make you aware of one key ways that time impacts the design of a game. When you're designing a game with a finite end that doesn't have any DLC, that doesn't have any updates, you look at the progression a lot. You want to make sure that the progression is the best experience ever. And a lot of the times, I know, at least for me, I start designing that first. For a forever game, whether it's DLC or free-to-play, whatever the content delivery system, you might want to start by designing the end game. Because here's what happens with your audience over time. Your game is out, you're getting good press, awesome, bunch of new users. Yay! And then over time, some of them will leave. Sorry if I burst your bubble. It's just gonna happen. And more of them, and then you'll kind of hit a plateau of a few players sticking around for a while, and then these are also going to dwindle down to a small minority sticking around for 3, 4, 6, 3 years. It's going to happen. Now, if this was a game with a finite end, that's not a problem. Few players finish the game, that's fine. But if your game keeps going, what happens over time is that more and more players pile up at the end. And then over time, what also happens is that your number of players coming in diminishes. And you have fewer players coming in and joining your game. Hopefully, you keep that number up as long as possible, because if no new player is coming in, your game is on its way to sunset. Because those players at the end, who are very engaged and have been with you for years, are still slowly but surely leaving your game. Now, what that means, and a thing that's important to consider, is that these players are your most engaged players. They're active on Facebook, they're spending money, they're super loud, they're training your new users, they're a key part of your community. You want to preserve them for as long as you can because they're making your machine run. But as I mentioned before, you also want to keep new players coming in, because if you don't, your game is slowly on its way to sunsetting. So, if you develop features for the early game, you're spending development time on that. You don't have development time for features for the end game. If you're spending time developing features for the end game, you don't have development time to make your tutorial better and make sure that new players come in and stay for as long as possible. So this creates a tug of war. And if your progression is in terms of months, that tug of war is super strong, because the difference of capacity and gameplay between your long-term player and your new player is 3 months. If you close that progression a little bit, then the disparity in the strength of that tug of war isn't as strong. Your audiences are closer together. The games that I've worked on all ran into that problem. And what ends up happening when you start designing update, and you want to make sure that each update performs as well as you can, is you start developing updates that fit maybe here. That hits most of your player population that are just past the tutorial. Elder players can play it, new players can play it, yay. But if you have features that are only accessible to your elder players, and you never deliver additional content for those features, they will tell you. And they won't be happy. And in some extreme cases, they may even say that you care more about your new players than your elder players, and get very angry about that. So you want to consider the way you're going to do your updates and what your progression looks like, so that your updates are as accessible as possible. Some games do it really, really well. Others have a little bit more of a challenge, and most of the time it boils down to how long your linear progression is. You want to make sure that ideally most of your players get into that end game state, which is different for every game, as soon as possible. And that doesn't mean that they have all the features. They may still have to unlock content, but they can go straight to that content. There's no longer a level bar or an arbitrary limit to them chasing that content. So if you do a special event, they can theoretically access it. They made it a little bit more work than a player that has been around for a long time, but they can still access that content. It's tempting to make the progression as long as possible. I understand that, because when we're early and you're launching that MVP, you want your content to last as long as you can, but be aware that it may make you very sad later on. Hindsight number 9. Evaluate your design with endless updates in mind. Now, when I say that, I don't mean have 5 years of updates designed before you launch. As we've established, we know nothing. So it's not going to hold no matter how hard you try to plan 5 years ahead. What you should do is get a broad idea of what your updates can look like and what your design requires in order to stay alive. So, looking at your design, there is kind of two extremes on a spectrum. Games that need bulks of new content to stay alive, and games that have systems that are very versatile and ever renewed, and you can just add a tiny bit of things in there, and the game is good for another 3 months. Now, I'm not sure this is the best way to break them apart. Someone smarter may come up with better words, but hopefully you get a general idea. So at this end of the spectrum, we have games like The Sims Freeplay, which is a game about customization and playing with a dollhouse. So to keep alive, this game needs more furniture, more clothes, more of all of that. And games that have a level-based structure like Angry Birds need more levels, because when players get at the end, they're at the end. What happens with this sort of game that you should be aware of is that you're going to need to keep a bigger team in live service to produce this content. And also, depending on the type of content, over time, your app or your game will become really, really huge in terms of space that it takes on the hard drive, because you're throwing in massive amounts of content to keep it alive, and that piles up over 5 years. It's not a bad thing. If you're doing a game based on customization, it's going to happen. But if you're aware of it, you can look at how you can optimize your art from the get-go to make it as light as possible so that your game can have as many updates without busting your friend's phone. What I put about in the middle are games that have some form of systems that keep them alive for a long time, but still require a good injection of content every now and then. So Drakensang has PvE and PvP. So players who are playing PvP will keep playing in that realm for a long time before they require additional content. And then if we want them to keep playing and renew that fun, we can throw a few more pieces of equipment in the loot system, and then people are chasing those and they're entertained again. Or we can add a whole new class and the world is redefined, and we've just added hours and hours and hours of gameplay without rebuilding environments and quests and all of that. Some updates will still require launching whole new areas with whole new dungeons. You've seen World of Warcraft do that. So that's why I put it in about the middle of that scale. Games like Candy Crush are level-based, so they still need to produce new levels, but their levels are a lot easier to produce than a sprawling MMO level. And the last one that I put on there is Warhammer End Times Vermintide, which is a PC game and console as well. The way they do updates is really, really good in terms of a premium product with DLC. So Vermintide is based on collaborative play. It's a little bit like Left 4 Dead and such. And the way they do their updates for new maps, when they launch DLC, they allow you to play the maps if you're on a team hosted by someone who has those maps. So as a player, I don't need to buy the DLC if I don't have the money right now to be able to keep playing with my friends. And except for the small progression at the beginning, most of the maps are just available once you buy them. So in that way, they make their DLC a lot more accessible. so that that whole divide and tug of war I was talking about is minimalized as much as possible. Now, more on the systems-focused end, games like Clash Royale, Summoner's War, Heroes Charge, that Blizzard game, now I'm blanking on the name. All of these games, what they do is they have really, really rich system, often based on PvP, and when they throw in a new card, it just changes the world. So the content updates that these games require over time are a lot smaller, and they will keep running. What that means is that you can then turn your team into a smaller skeleton team that is focusing on tuning, which is crucial for these type of updates, and then potentially have your artists start doing something else. So you don't need to fall into one end of the spectrum or the other. Just be aware of how your design choices impacts the future of your game, and make sure that you have in your back of your mind a broad idea of how you're going to keep updating this game and making it fun. Last tip: design your players' expectation. So you all know the importance of good reward systems, right? You want to make sure that when players do something, they get appropriately rewarded for their effort. And that may look like player has completed a mission, they get a potato. Yay! The first time you do that sort of thing, it establishes the value of the actions the players take in their game and how they relate to rewards. That's how they establish what the logic of your game is. If then you end up growing your team and you have a little bit more time to do rewards, and suddenly a completed mission means a potato and a carrot for the same mission, players will love you for it. They will be absolutely happy with that. Getting more stuff for the same amount of effort, yay! But then you can never go back to giving them only a potato. Never. They will burn you at the stakes. No, it's not that bad, but depends how you go. But it will trigger a lot of anger in your community. So if you've decided that a completed mission is worth a potato and your art team smashed it and produced a whole bunch of assets, you may want to reserve those for another update instead of putting them as prizes for this one. Because when you start skewing your players' read on how valuable the actions they take in your game are, you can never go back. And that can create a lot of creeping and a lot more requirements on you and your team to produce ever bigger and bigger and bigger things, which will happen, but you want to keep an eye on that. And also, when you're tuning things, it's better to be tighter and then release. So don't give as many rewards and then give a little bit more than to give too much and have to take it back, because then we fall into this. So when you tune something and you feel that it's tuned a little bit too hard, that's potentially okay. You'll have an update, you can fix it, you can improve it, but at least you won't lose control of your economy over 5 years. And to wrap it up, because your self-appointed Time Lord is running out of time, remember that unfortunately we know nothing, and things are going to change so much that the only thing we can do is embrace the minimum viable product, test everything, look at the data, and know what we need to know in order to improve what we're doing. Make sure that you befriend your community manager, because they can give you the pulse of your community and help you manage when we make mistakes and make it all better. Document your stuff, because you're going to bite your nails if you don't. And then make sure that you keep an eye out for things that take a lot of time, make tools for them so that you save a lot of time over 5 years. Consider having a big end game that players can stay in forever and have fun forever, and shortening the progression to that end game so that they can all access the content and you don't get into a ridiculous tug of war between your new players and your old players. Evaluate your design for endless updates and know what your design means in terms of team structure and type of updates that are going to come out and what the challenges are on that front. And remember to design your players' expectation and respect your own rule. And it's better to go a little bit tighter and release than to try to go the other way around. That's it. I'm not sure we have time for questions. I'm told no time for questions, so I will be outside the room if anyone wants to come to me and ask. Thank you.